Steve.
We're pleased to welcome now Christina Dent, founder and president of End It for Good. So, Christina, since the president took office, and he told us about this the entire time he was running for the office, that he intended to close the border, and he was especially concerned about the flow of this deadly drug across the border, and talked regularly about how it was affecting the lives of Americans, and in fact snuffing out the lives, unfortunately, of many unsuspecting young people in particular. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, may be the number one cause of death of our young people in this country.
Death, yeah.
And so he has really demanded, and using tariffs as a method to get the neighboring countries of Canada, mainly Mexico, of course, to react and respond and be more proactive in stemming the flow of fentanyl across our border. But tell us about this. I don't really know a lot about it. All I've heard in the reporting of this issue in our country is that most of the young people that end up passing away as a result of a deadly dose don't even know they're ingesting it.
Yeah, so fentanyl has been a big problem, especially in the last couple of years. During COVID, it became a massive problem. We can talk about why that is. But first off, just what is fentanyl? It's an opioid. We've been using it medically for decades, since the 1960s. Anybody in a hospital setting who had surgery has been given fentanyl. It does not hurt people when it's given in appropriate doses that they can, in a medical setting. So that's happening every day in every hospital in Mississippi many times. What happened is the illicit market figured out how to manufacture fentanyl, and it became part of the underground drug supply, not just the medical drug supply.
Gotcha.
That's where the problem comes in, because you can't dose something that you don't have any quality control over. So people are getting whatever random thing they buy on the street. Maybe it has fentanyl in it. Maybe it's purely fentanyl. Maybe they don't have any idea how much it might have in it. And it can cause an overdose. So how does an overdose happen? Well, opioids decrease your respiratory rate because they suppress the part of your brain that controls your breathing. So if you take opioids and you take too much of them, your brain is going to forget to breathe. And if you take too much of that and you forget to breathe for too long, you're going to die. So it's important to understand why that is, because it's not like you just take too much and suddenly you just die and it's crazy. This is like a physiological happening that's happening to your body, that your breathing rate decreases and you can't stay alive without air. So you can reverse that through the reversal drug naloxone. It flushes the opioids off your opioid receptors, allows you to start breathing again. But what's happened is fentanyl has started coming across. It started out coming through the mail system, mostly, coming from China. There was pressure on China to stop that flow. That flow did stop, but it just shifted. Now it goes through Mexico, often in the form of precursors that come to Mexico. Mexico cartels there synthesize that into fentanyl, which can be made in a lab. So this is not crop dependent. It doesn't have to be in a certain climate. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have square footage and miles of land to grow this. You can make it in a lab anywhere in the world that you want to. So it's being made there, and then it is being smuggled across the border. Less than 1% comes from Canada. Canada is not the problem when it comes to fentanyl.
Southern border.
Yes, it's coming through the southern border, but, and this is what's really, really important and what I think we're missing in this conversation, 88% of the fentanyl that border security interdicts comes through ports of entry. It's not coming through the wide open spaces of land in between ports of entry. It's coming through ports of entry. 80% of it is coming through with U.S. citizens. So this is almost entirely U.S. citizens that are taking fentanyl through a legal port of entry because they are legal U.S. citizens.
For the purpose of using it, selling it, distributing?
Selling it.
Okay.
They get hired by cartels, and it's, I mean, if you think about, so the Border Patrol says that they believe they interdict about 3% of cocaine. It's the only drug that they give us a number of how much they think of the total amount that's being smuggled. They think they get about 3%. So let's say that they're as effective at getting fentanyl as they are at getting cocaine, which they've been working on for decades.
Yeah.
And they get 3%. Well, they say that they arrest 75% of people that are trying to get across the border illegally. So if you're a cartel, who are you going to hire? Are you going to hire someone who has a 3% chance of getting caught or has a 75% chance of getting caught?
Okay, so wait a second. Is it against the law to bring this stuff through legal ports of entry?
Oh, yeah.
It's just
definitely
not getting detected?
Yeah. There's just there are, millions of people crossing the border for legitimate reasons that are citizens, that are non-citizens, that are doing nothing more than just living their lives. They're on business, they're on vacation, whatever. And it's real. You can't search every single person that wants to cross the border every single time they cross the border.
Yeah.
And so you've got lots of people. They catch some of them. They don't catch most of them. And the reason why it is even harder to catch is because cartels are smart. They're business people. So they're thinking, how do we have the least amount of risk and the highest amount of profit? Well, we're going to send it through whatever means it is that is going to be the easiest way for it to get through. And that is with U.S. citizens through ports of entry.
I guess I'm a little surprised that, given how big a problem this is, that and to your point, it's impossible to physically search every bag and every person that's coming across, that there wouldn't be some sort of technology that has been invented that could detect the presence of this substance as it's moving through that checkpoint.
Yeah. No, and interestingly, so if you think about what was even easier to detect, which was marijuana back when there was lots of marijuana being smuggled across the border, which has basically ended now that states have legalized inside the U.S., it is not profitable for cartels to smuggle marijuana. That industry has just about ended across the border. But even for marijuana, it has a really potent smell. It's much easier to detect. And even all of our enforcement efforts, doubling the size of Border Patrol, none of that had an impact on the amount of marijuana that was able to get across the border. The only thing that did is when states began moving that market locally, which decreased the demand for cartel-supplied marijuana. People don't want to buy it from them. They just want to buy it from their local manufacturer.
All right, so help me understand then of the use in this country. Do you have any data that says, well, that's intentional use versus accidental use?
No, I have not seen any data on that, but there is a lot of intentional use. So part of the reason that we got fentanyl is before COVID happened and the travel bans happened, for non-emergency travel across the southern border, about 30% of seizures of fentanyl and heroin-related drugs were fentanyl. So only about 30% at that point was fentanyl coming across the border. Then we had the travel bans. We go about 2 years of that. By the end of the travel bans, we've got 90% fentanyl coming across. Now, why is that? Well, we squeezed the amount of drugs that could come across, and we know what's going to happen when we put pressure on the supply, which is drugs are going to get more potent because they're easier to smuggle. So people still wanted heroin, but they got introduced to fentanyl because it is about 50 times more potent than heroin. So you think about that from a market perspective. You can make one trip with fentanyl across the border, or you can make 50 trips with heroin. Well, from a risk perspective, you're going to make one with fentanyl. But it doesn't end there, because fentanyl is not by any means the most potent drug that could be coming across our border. Nitazines are already out there. They're 20 times more potent than fentanyl is. So let's say that we completely cut off, through some miracle that no one has ever done, somehow we completely cut off fentanyl coming across the southern border. Number one, people would just start manufacturing it inside the U.S. because you can make it anywhere. But number two, cartels would just start smuggling something else. There's nitazines, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of fentanyl and different kinds of things other than fentanyl that you can smuggle. And so this is a market issue. There is demand for mood-altering, mind-altering drugs, and cartels are happy to supply that. They're going to supply it in the least risky way possible for them, which is high potency, small packages. And we saw that COVID did exactly what we would expect.
stay with us through the break and get your take on what can we do to effectively address this issue, because it just seems like, to your point, in my view, if people want to put this stuff in their body, they're going to figure out a way to get it. Somebody's going to figure out a way to sell it to them. So how do we address that problem? We got Christina Dent with End It for Good. We're Good Days. We're visiting with Christina Dent. She's the president of End It for Good. So, Christina, this problem, it just seems like no matter what we do, just like the drug problem in general, we spent a lot of money, we've invested a lot in law enforcement, but the problem persists. I'm talking about drug abuse. The abuse of illicit drugs and harmful drugs persists. I think what's so scary about this fentanyl deal is that such a small amount of it can be deadly. And I guess I would ask the question of you, is border security going to solve this problem?
No, it's not, because it's not a border problem. It is a supply and demand problem. There's a lot of people in the United States that want to change the way that they feel. They can't do that through drugs that they can access legally, and so they're going to buy them from the underground market. When you have a market that's worth $500 billion a year, do we really think people are going to just allow that pile of money to sit there? No, they're not. They're going to supply whatever drugs either people want or whatever drugs they want to sell. And if people are desperate enough, they're going to buy whatever is available to them, even if that's not the thing they want. So if they were using heroin and their dealer says, hey, I'm all out of heroin, but I've got something else for you, and you're in withdrawals because you're already dependent on an opioid, well, chances are pretty high you're going to try that thing. And so now we have lots and lots of people who are using drugs that are now dependent on fentanyl, or they've developed a preference for fentanyl over heroin. It has a different kind of high for it. So I love that you're asking the question. When we step out and we look back, we've got decades of history now. We keep doing a lot of things and throwing a lot of money at it, and we keep seeing this is not helping. It's not actually solving the problem. I think that's because it is partially we're coming at it the wrong way. We keep thinking that more enforcement is going to stop either people using drugs or people selling drugs. But people sell drugs because there's an economic incentive to. There's a lot of money to be made in it. And people use drugs because they want to feel better than they do right now. So we can help on the consumption side by helping people deal with the deeper pain in their life. And on the market side, beginning to internalize the problem that the more you crack down on something, the more potent it's going to get, and the less control you have over it, and the more innovative the criminal market is going to become, and the more money is going to go into their coffers to use for all sorts of bad activity that none of us want. This is the path of drug prohibition. Now, do I want people randomly being able to go buy fentanyl in the drugstore? No, that is not the approach. But we have got to begin figuring out how we can move some of these consumer markets back into maybe under the care of a doctor, maybe under very strict regulations, maybe only used in treatment. But we know what path this takes for us. When you prohibit a popular substance, it will move underground, it will become unregulated and higher potency, and it will fund criminal activity. We may not all agree on the solutions to that, but those are the facts that we know from Economics 101 is going to happen, and we're dealing with the fallout of that. And you see that it's not a border problem because most fentanyl is coming across the border with U.S. citizens at ports of entry. If we think about the number of people who are arrested trying to illegally cross the border, you have to arrest 12,000 people trying to illegally come across the border before you catch one who has fentanyl with them. This is not a problem of people trying to make their way across the border illegally and they've got a sack of fentanyl on their back. And I think that's a little bit of the image that we get sometimes from the news, is that that's sort of the problem here. It's not. We have U.S. citizens being hired by cartels to move fentanyl across ports of entry. And I actually talked to a guy a couple of years ago, and he had come out of this, but he had previously been involved in a pretty big marijuana underground activity in the United States. And he said, the way I moved my marijuana is I hired this old grandmother just this nice grandmother who would drive her old, Caprice Classic across the country for me, filled with marijuana. And nobody ever suspected her because it was just this nice grandma driving her Caprice Classic down the highway. It's a similar situation. Cartels are going to look for the least likely people to move their drugs because they don't want them to get caught. So we got to work on that market side. On the consumer side, there's a lot of things we could do, even here in Mississippi, to deal with that. So one of those would be removing drug treatment centers from our certificate of need laws.
Which has been tried.
Yes.
But unsuccessfully.
Correct. We have far too big of a problem to be putting barriers up for more types of treatment to be available, more options for treatment. Mississippi's a rural state. People can't hardly get to treatment, even if they can find a bed that they can pay for in treatment. So we can remove some of those regulatory barriers. There's also some really interesting new treatments for drugs, for drug addiction that are out there that could be brought here. Kentucky has a whole series of faith-based treatment centers that have been for about 10 years using this new technology called neuroelectric therapy. And it sounds crazy. You put these electrodes behind your ears it stimulates your vagus nerve, and it keeps people from going through withdrawal symptoms, and it resets their brain and their opioid receptors, and it can also be used for other drugs like methamphetamine, and it allows them to come back to a kind of the way that their mind was before they ever started using drugs. It starts working in about 20 minutes. You can take someone who is in full withdrawal symptoms, and within 20 minutes of having this thing on, their body calms down. They're able to have a normal conversation with you. There's no shaking. There's no nausea.
So I have acquaintances with a number of physicians in the local area, and I've talked to them about this. Now, they represent sort of a cross-section of medical disciplines, but they still have a very good understanding, more than the average person, of the human body and its physiological characteristics. They say some of us are just born with this addictive sort of DNA, or just a propensity to be more addicted to anything. It doesn't have to be drugs. It could be gambling or tobacco or virtually anything. And some are just less prone to addiction, can truly just do things in moderation and put it down and not be addicted. Is that something that maybe medical science is working on addressing?
Yeah, we do know that there is genetic predispositions toward addiction.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that you will become addicted. If you had, if your dad was an alcoholic, doesn't mean you're going to become one, but you do have a higher genetic predisposition towards alcoholism.
Okay.
You need to be careful with that. And some people say, you know what, I don't even want to risk that. I'm just not going to touch alcohol because I saw it be such a problem in my family.
Yeah, I know people like that. Sure, I think we all
sounds
have.
like a good plan to me. But we also know that the primary factor that causes addiction is what people experience in their lives. So if they go through a lot of difficult experiences, or even one as a child, a really traumatic event can have it dramatically increases a person's risk of becoming addicted.
Okay.
What we do know is whether it is genetic predisposition or it is environmental factors, experiences, trauma, whatever it might be, it is not the result of some people are good and some people are bad and the bad people use drugs and the good people don't. It is not at all related to that, which is why you have parents who will say, this is like my sweetest, most sensitive child. I hear this all the time. My most sensitive, most compassionate, big-hearted child is the one that struggles with addiction. It's the least one of all their children. They didn't think any of them were going to, of course, but it's always the one they think, man, I can't believe it was this child. It's not because they're a bad kid. It's because something is going on deep inside, and they are self-medicating that with drugs. That becomes a problem. And that person can engage in all sorts of really harmful behavior. But we've got to deal with the root cause of why they're using. And the more we can do that, the better. There's becoming more resources for families out there. There's a great book called Beyond Addiction. Highly recommend for family members to understand addiction and how they can help their loved one.
So your organization, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We're kind of running out of time. Just want to get your position on and what you're advocating for which I believe is more towards regulation as opposed to prohibition. We got about 20 seconds left. Your thoughts on that?
Yep. And I think we got to start figuring out, how could this work? How could we take one step in that direction? Because if we want to see fewer people dying, if we want to see less crime, less cartel activity, we've got to figure out how to move that market out of their hands.
Gotcha. Christina Dent is the founder and president of End It for Good. Appreciate you coming on, Christina. Thanks.
Thanks.
We're coming right back, folks, in the Element Well studio at 12:05. It's Senator Daniel Sparks.